okay, there's no amount of sauce, there's no amount of color, there's no amount of taste that will make this kare-kare because this is not oxtail. Or even put it another way, nowadays there are plenty. You go to restaurants and you'll find beef kare-kare, they will say. Or what do you call that? Seafood kare-kare. Well, okay, fine. So they have reduced kare-kare to a way of flavoring, a way of cooking, but that changes the whole idea. Kare-kare has it's a traditional dish. It has a specific composition, the proteins of which should be buntot, oxtail, and tripe. If you're going to put some beef into it, well, okay, that's a recent invention, but the traditional dish of kare-kare will have to have oxtail and tripe. And if it doesn't have that, then it's not kare-kare anymore. You can invent another name, but that's adjusting it. And that's what happens with marriage as well. Marriage has a specific content, and we're going to see that closely. And so, therefore, if it's not that, if it doesn't have that content, then it's not a marriage. So, what was it then? It's a fiction of marriage. And it's a job of the court, the competent tribunal, to declare it as such. Note, this is not an annulment. Definitely, it's not a divorce because there's nothing to annul and there's nothing to divorce, but rather it's a declaration that marriage never existed here. So what you have is a fiction of marriage. Now, of course, in order to do something like that, nobody can do that unilaterally and just claim, I think my marriage was invalid. No. And that's where the juridic structure comes in. In order for a reality, no matter how convincing it might be, no matter how personally convicted we might be about that reality or convinced about that reality, if we're going to make it stand in court, make it stand in the juridic matrix, in the juridic system, it must have what I am fond of calling a juridic structure. It must be provable in court. It must stand muster because it has been articulated in specific laws which are exigible. There's a word. You look it up in the dictionary that exists. In Spanish, of course, that's a very normal word, exigible. But it's only recently that I discovered that it exists in English, exigible, which means demandable. You can demand it. That's what makes something juridic, you know. Until something can be demanded, can be enforced, can be precisely, is exigible because it was established in a norm, it was articulated in its composition, in its expression, it's in its registration. Unless it can be that, then it may be real. In the same way that you and I were very real, you're very real. But unless you have a birth certificate, unless you have a residence, unless you I don't know all kinds of documentation, then you don't exist. The same way with your actuations. You can only act a certain way. Oh, sure, you can do whatever you want, but it won't have any legal standing or any juridic importance or constancy unless it's done according to law, because we're living in a state of law and we're not in the wild. Now, the same thing happens with marriage, that the content of marriage is established. So therefore, if somebody gets married and any one of those ingredients are not there, like the kare-kare without the buntot or without the tripe, then it's not kare-kare, it's not marriage. And it will have to be for the expert to declare, no, this is not kare-kare. And if you join a culinary contest with that, then you will be disqualified because you have invented something which does not follow the canons of cooking kare-kare, etc. And then as far as the second objection is concerned, the freedom of choice. Look at this. I hope you took your coffee after lunch because I'm demanding a lot of intellectual, shall we say, perspicacity here, sharpness. A divorce law will not only affect those marriages which want a divorce. a divorce law affects all marriages because it changes the definition of marriage to something which cannot be dissolved to something which can be dissolved. So even if a person, your own marriage, for example, even if you're very, you're very solid in your marriage, by the fact of a divorce bill, the quality of your marriage is undermined, is watered down because now it can be impugned. Hopefully nobody impugns it, that neither of you will impugn it, but it's already impugnable. Unlike before, when it couldn't be impugned. So that's the fallacy of that argument of freedom of choice. Because the law does not behave that way. A divorce bill is all encompassing. It affects everyone, not just those marriages which will be assailed or what do you call this, in which rather the spouses would want a divorce. All marriages will be hitherto or henceforth divorceable, as we can say, as I might say. Now let's move on. What do we do with this bill? The first thing we need to address is to remove the red herring. You know, the divorce bill is already dead, right? Right now in this particular Congress. Okay, it passed Congress, but it can't possibly pass the Senate. It's dead on the water. Why? Why not? Well, because it's very divisive. We're just a year away from elections, and nobody's going to touch that and risk supporting it and getting it passed, but then losing the elections next year because that's a very unpopular bill for half of the population or something like that. No? So that's dead on the water. But that's not my point. The point is, why do we have to waste time every year in this exercise? As I said, I mean, nowadays, if somebody invites me to Congress and I got invited and also in the Senate, I never go anymore because I really see it's a waste of time. They're not up to an intelligent discussion anyway. They don't give you enough airtime. They don't read the documents, and there's no way of understanding these issues by executive summaries. You know, you have to go a little bit deeper into it. So it's a waste of time. But it's time that we do waste every year, every time this is filed. So what I'd like to happen in this coalition is to attack this in such a way that it can never be filed again. And the first step is this herring, is to show it once and for all that this is illegal. This is anti-constitutional. There's a reason why when it was passed and a lot of people got nervous. Me, I have never been nervous with this thing because even if it passes in the Senate, it can be assailed for unconstitutionality, and the Supreme Court will most probably rule against it. But again, it's going to be a waste, an awful waste of time, in that exercise. God knows there's so many other issues that this country has that need to be addressed rather than this stupidity which is called the divorce bill. And I don't mind calling it stupidity because that's what it is. You have to call things by their name. No? So, why is it illegal? First, the Philippine Constitution, Article 15, Section 2, describes marriage as an inviolable social institution. Problem many times with people is they're nominalists. Okay, they change the content of concepts, the content even of names, of nouns, to their own liking. There are three words there which are constitutional in nature, meaning to say untouchable because they're in the Constitution, unless you make a constitutional amendment, which is in Spanish we would call it palabras mayores, no? Son, what do you call this? Major things. It's not a small thing to make a constitutional amendment. And what are these? Inviolable social institution. Three words. First is the word institution. Let's not be careless about the use of the word institution. When you say that something is an institution, for those of you who are more, shall we say, educated in English, you know, it's something when something is an institution, he is an institution in college, or he's an institution in the movie and in the movie industry, or he is an institution in the Senate. It's been there since the Velociraptors, etc. Like that meme once showed my good friend, you know, because it's been there so long. An institution comes from the Latin word instituere, to be instituted. An institution is something given, instituted by somebody else. So therefore, it's not anymore subject to normal human commerce or business or negotiation. It's there. It's a given. It's established. Not that it's instituted in stone. Of course, it can be changed, but not easily, like the Philippine Constitution is. You don't just change the Constitution, you know. So it's an institution. Now, what kind of an institution is it? It's a natural institution. That's even a stronger word. It's not an institution that was put up by the raising of hands, like what happens with the Constitution of the Philippines, the Malolos Convention, etc., by a constitutional convention. No, it's an institution which is given by nature itself. It's the nature of things to be like that. We're not the author of human nature. We're not the author of nature in itself. It's something given. It was put there by the creator. The problem with our age is precisely this postmodernism, where people are doubt everything. At first blush, it seems like a humility to doubt. I'm not so sure. I'm not sure. No, not to be sure is a cover up for not wanting to abide by what has been established. So, in other words, to put skepticism, intellectual skepticism, to be able to change concepts and the contents of concepts because we don't want things to be the way they are. Example, I'm going to touch something which will raise, in Spanish again, we say, levanta ampollas, no, which will raise boils. In Tagalog, we would have say, nakaka-nosebleed, no? Here, in where we're more decent, we say nosebleed. The Spaniards would say, nakakatubo ng pigsa sa puwet, no? So that's what levantar ampollas means, you know. At least we're more delicate. We just say, nosebleed, no? Which is, and here's the thing that I will raise, all the business of the LGBTQ, the gender problem. Pardon the aside, but it illustrates the point very well. First of all, they tried to come up with the SOGI bill, making use of the entry point of protecting those with gender confusion, gender problems, appealing to their human rights, which, by the way, is correct because everybody has a human right as human beings. But for that to segue into defining homosexual rights, transgender rights, that's a different story. You have a right to that as a human being. You don't have a right to that as a homosexual. Because there's no such thing as a homosexual rights in their homosexuality for the simple reason that homosexuality is an aberration, is an abnormality. What is normal is to be man, woman, and the gender that follows each one automatically is masculine, feminine. Gender is not a matter of choice, it's a matter of sex. And we are sex, so we're also gendered. However, since gender is developed in education, in upbringing, it can admit of abnormalities. Nobody can be abnormally male. If you're XX, you're female. If you're XY in your chromosome, you're male. Of course, the genetic material that will follow that, the physiological, or I would say the hormonal content of that, can admit of variations. And that's the reason why you have certain women with more masculine characteristics. They grow a mustache, and they're very muscular, but they're still women. Or men who are a little bit more effeminate in their structure. But the behavior that will follow it, that's a matter of choice. No matter how physically, shall we say, unmasculine I may be, physically feminine I may be, lalampa-lampa, payat, balingkinitan, or something, I can still choose to act in a masculine way. It's a matter of choice. And that's what happens with these things. Now, segue that to the nature of marriage. Marriage has an intrinsic nature. Is that union between a man and a woman, which the law can only reflect, can only, shall we say, manifest in the juridic matrix of a society, articulate in laws, but following it, not going against it. Because when a law goes against the nature of things, by that very fact, it becomes irrational. And by that very fact, it loses its, shall we say, its right or its claim to exigibility. You cannot demand something that goes against nature. On the contrary, one is even obliged to disobey a law that goes against nature. But that precisely is the problem. We're living in an age where people doubt the very notion of nature. We're living in a civilization, the post-Christian era, the post-modernistic age, which really is just a rehash of medieval errors of nominalism of William of Ockham, that will later went on to René Descartes and Kant and all the romantics of the 18th and 19th centuries, to the modernism which was condemned by Pope Pius X in the beginning of the 20th century, only to rise up, rear up its ugly head again after the Second Vatican Council in the post-conciliar crisis. And this is the thing that we have right now. People hindi magkamayaw, no? The other day, somebody made I got introduced to the notion, it's the first time I heard it, of the so-called Kamala salad, no? This Kamala Harris is very fond of, you know, repeating things and turning them around, and it's like making a salad, no? Makes you think. What did she say? What did she really want to say? It's like a salad of concepts. To which I objected because I said, as I said, I like cooking. A salad is composed of ingredients that are put together. I mean, good ingredients that are put together by a fantastic sauce or dressing that binds the whole thing into a unity. In the case of Kamala Harris, what she has are bad ingredients and then a very bad what they call this binder, that instead of having a salad, a nice salad, what you have there is a diarrhea of sorts. No, it's a mental diarrhea rather than a salad, a beautiful salad. No, imagine if you make a halo halo. Halo halo is one of our national desserts, right? I mean, who doesn't love a halo halo? But imagine if you make a halo halo and the compositions will be something very sour, right? You know, like sampalok, unsweetened, and then something really odd in taste, like what? Like okra, and something still other in taste, like ampalaya. And then you put all of that together with the nice ice, and then the dressing that you put into it is suka. Hmm? So what's going to do with that? It's not going to be, yeah, it's a halo-halo, but halo-halo for making you sick more than anything else. And that's what happens with this red herring.
Iniwan
So
ka ba?
first, the Constitution says
Bayad mo
that
dyan.
it's,
Na.
we have the principle of statutory construction, which says that clear and unequivocal language must be interpreted literally. Now, the Constitution's framing of marriage as an inviolable, explicit, as inviolable rather, explicitly excludes provisions for divorce. So it's an inviolable social institution. So that's very clear. So if you're going to institute divorce, then you're violating it. Second, legislative actions reinforce this interpretation. The Family Code of the Philippines, which provides for legal separation, annulment, and declaration of nullity, excludes divorce. So in other words, even in the organic law regarding marriage and family, because that's what the family code is, it's an organic law. You know, there's a hierarchy of laws. You have the Constitution, and then you have big laws that are almost as constitutional as the Constitution. And one of that precisely is the family code. It's the organic law regarding marriage and family. It contains annulment, declaration of nullity, and separation, but doesn't include divorce. So therefore, if you're going to institute divorce, you're going to violate the family codes, aside from violating the Constitution. And no normal legislation should be able to do that. Is it possible to do that? Yes, but you have to change the family code and you'll have to change the Constitution first. Otherwise, that law will be against the family code and against the Constitution. Therefore, marriage's defined inviolability inherently prohibits the legalization of divorce without a constitutional amendment. His position not only respects the literal interpretation of the Constitution, but also honors the historical and cultural ethos of the Filipino people. But we go back to the social reality of irreparably broken unions, which, as I said, is really the driving force behind the growing acceptance of the divorce bill among the legislators and even among the public. The reality of dysfunctional and irreparably broken unions. Note, I used the word unions. Earlier, I used the word marriage, but I wanted to put it in italics because in the preponderant majority of such cases, the reason for the marital breakdown is a serious defect in that marriage from the start, resulting in a veritable fiction of marriage. What is needed, therefore, more than a divorce law, is a juridical mechanism for the declaration of nullity of such marriages. Not a divorce law, which would affect all marriages, but laws which will make the declaration of nullity more efficient, more, shall we say, accessible, more or smoother in its acquisition. That will only affect, therefore, the specific dysfunctional or irreparably broken unions. Now, from that introduction, let's get down to deeper realities, how to think about marriage and its juridic structure. And what I'm going to show in the next 10 minutes is that marriage is nothing but the institutional expression of conjugal love. As such, it must respect the institutional content of conjugal love, which means the ends of marriage, the natural ends of marriage, and two, the essential properties of marriage. Those properties that follow if those ends are accepted. Let's try to understand this. Any action is for an end. That's a philosophical principle. Actiones sunt propter finem. Things are the way they are because of the finality for which they are. So true is this that in the more, shall we say, primitive languages like Tagalog, for example, Filipino, Filipino is primitive, of course it is. No, it's a very simple language. If you want a sophisticated language, think of Spanish, French, and all of those. Italian. More sophisticated still, think of Latin. More sophisticated still, think of Greek. And then there's a sophisticated language. But Filipino is quite simple. That in the more simple languages, more primitive languages, the names reflect the finality. That's why you call a bench or rather a stool an upuan. You say, what is an upuan? Well, that's something where you sit on, or salumpwit, which is even more graphic, right? Higaan, silid hapunan, or whatever, no? So things like those. Because they explain the end for which it is. Now, the fundamental reality of marriage is conjugal love. You will recall how when the RH bill was still a bill, there was an awful lot of objection to it from the Episcopal Conference, from the CVCP. What was the objection to the RH bill? The most important objection to the RH bill was the reduction of marriage through sexual education to sex. Meaning to say, instead of teaching reproductive rights or conjugal love as part behind all of that, what was going to be taught in all those years of sex education was sex. And since you can only talk so much about sex, because, you think about it, what can you talk about sex? Animals engage in sex without even being taught about it, something instinctive. And yet you're going to teach it for 6 years, because that's what it is right now in the K-12 program. It's being taught for 6 years, perhaps even 8. So what content will you put that in the sex education? What's put into it rather are the aberrations of sexual behavior, contraception, and all the abnormalities, etc., which children don't need to know about. And nobody talks about the basic reality, which is conjugal love. Now, what is conjugal love? That's the fundamental reality underlying marriage and family. Conjugal love is the mutual self-giving and acceptance of a man and a woman in the totality of their personhood, meaning to say, as man and as woman. Because come to think of it, you don't see human beings walking around. What you see are male humans and female humans. That we are sexed. Like the rest of the animal kingdom, they are sexed. It is in the exercise of our sexuality. I'm not talking about genital sexuality, but being man, being woman, the self-giving. I give myself as a man to this woman who will accept me in her femininity, accept my masculinity. Now that total self-giving is aimed at the perfection of that personhood in all its dimensions. That's what conjugal love is. There are
Pagkatas
many
dito,
other kinds of love. Love of friendship, for example. In the love of friendship, what do you have?
Like,
Two people
card ko nandiyan na sa
giving themselves to each other for the perfection of the other as a person, or perhaps it's even more limited. Look at the friendship between buddies, Navy SEALs in a given squad or platoon. They're giving themselves in each other, not as human beings, but as elements of a Navy's SEAL platoon, meaning to say, as soldiers, as special warriors, etc., and they all have their positions within that squad. One is a sharpshooter, the other one is like this, another one's like that. But when the self-giving and acceptance is as a man and as a woman in the totality of their personhood as masculine and feminine, then that's what you call conjugal love. And what is the finality of that? Like any other friendship, the perfection of the parties, of the spouses. Not the perfection as human beings only, but the perfection as man and as woman. Which contains, because when two people give themselves to each other sexually, that openness to reproduction, procreation actually in our sense, in our case rather, because we don't just reproduce, we procreate. We allow God to create a new soul, a new human being who is a spiritual being, a person. And that's the reason why openness to life belongs to the finality of marriage. It's not just the mutual perfection of the spouses, it's also the procreation and bringing of children, which, as you know very well, will depend on the organism, meaning to say, love, the only thing that love demands is openness to it, not actual reproduction. because that will depend on the biological factors. Sometimes that may fail, but in principle, they're open to it. And that's the reason why if a person is not open to reproduction, it's contraceptive. Therefore, well, there's no conjugal love. And that's something that we need to explain time and again, because many times people confuse conjugal love with sex attraction, with some kind of a chemistry between the two sexes. Well, okay, that's part of it, but that's not it. Because that kind of excitement, that kind of chemistry may disappear sooner or later. But conjugal love must remain if it's conjugal love, because conjugal love is an act of the will, and the will is always free, regardless of the passions or of the emotions that may come with it. And that's the reason why in conjugal love, remember your spousal vows, for richer or for poorer, in health, sickness, or in health. And here's the most important, for better or for worse. Many times people forget this. Love does not end just because the other party got worse. Because there's a possibility somebody might get worse. Sometimes without their will, somebody got sick, somebody got insane, fell into Parkinson or even Alzheimer's, and begins to lose their mind. Sometimes it's willful. Like, I don't know, somebody starts being unfaithful, falls into gambling and all kinds of vices. For as long as those things happen afterwards, they do not affect the coming about of the marriage. That marriage is valid. And in principle, the innocent party committed himself or herself to remain in that union because he wanted to. If somebody, by the way, is not ready to do that, and if you can prove that a posteriori that somebody was not willing to do that, that's a ground for declaration of nullity. It's exclusion of the essential properties of marriage. So if somebody got married, but only meant only for better, not for worse. Oh, never mind the for in richer or poorer. I'm willing to get poorer, or in sickness and in health, and that's okay if somebody gets sick. But what if he gets worse? I don't accept that. Then you didn't get married. Already you're seeing the tip of the iceberg. That many problems in marriage are because of this. That people got married, they were not really thinking of a marriage that way. So if that marriage fell apart because they were not ready really for worse part, divorce is not the answer. Declaration of nullity is. Because if you can prove that, and here's where the cookie crumbles, because in civil law, there are no laws, there are no, shall we say, juridical instruments to prove that. But in canon law, there is. So it's a matter of adapting those provisions that will show that, in fact, at the time of the marriage, one was reserving certain essential qualities of marriage or excluding certain essential qualities of marriage, in which case the tribunal can say that that marriage is invalid from the start. You don't need to annul it, because annulment is really equivalent to divorce, but we have to declare that it was null. So conjugal love, therefore, is the mutual self-giving and acceptance of a man and a woman in the totality of their personhood, as man and as woman, aim at the perfection of that personhood in all its dimensions. Marriage is nothing but the institutional expression of conjugal love, and family is the natural fruit of conjugal love. So the ends of marriage, therefore, have been traditionally expressed in the church as the so-called tria bona matrimoni, the three goods of marriage. Good defined as the finality, what perfects a thing. In juridic parlance, we can speak of the pretension, that which is primarily sought by the juridic act of marriage or of getting married. And these are the good of fidelity, the bonum fide, reducible to the good of the spouses or the bonum conjugi. And then you have the good of offspring, the bonum prole, which is the sanctity of human life, the possibility of reproduction or procreation. And then you have the good of the family, the bonum familia, which is the cradle of humanity. All of those are the natural ends of marriage. But there's a fourth one for those who are baptized. Of course, this doesn't belong anymore to the natural institution of marriage. That won't find any reflection in civil law, because civil law is not that. But in canon law, yes, there's a fourth, which is the good of the sacrament, the bonum sacramenti. Because for the baptized, that natural institution of marriage with the finality that we have studied or seen so far, with the essential qualities that we have seen so far, has been raised by Jesus Christ to become a sacrament. And remember, the definition of a sacrament is the visible sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So in other words, that natural reality of a man and a woman falling in love and setting up a life, a consortium of love and life for the finality of mutual perfection, mutual help, mutual companionship, and for the possible procreation and upbringing of children. Now that was raised by Christ so that it becomes now a sacrament, an avenue for God to give his grace. Pardon me, but when I said the essential qualities, I took it for granted we took it, but I just now, in hindsight, realized that we didn't take it. What are the essential qualities of conjugal love? The essential qualities are those qualities which are inseparable from the consecution of the natural ends that define that union. What are the natural ends again? Mutual help, procreation and upbringing of children, and the good of the family. Now, what are the qualities essential for the attainment of those ends? And you have two. Number one, monogamy. And number two, indissolubility. And let's very briefly tackle that, because that has to be laid to rest as an institution, as a immovable consideration. Love, which is total, which is what conjugal love is the total self-giving of a man in the totality of his personhood as man to a woman in the totality of her femininity as woman, and accepted. Make that mutual, that's what you call conjugal love. Now, if it's like that, look at this. One cannot give himself and then take it back. Whatever is given is not yours anymore. That's what differentiates giving, donation, from lending. Conjugal love is not conjugal lending. Against conjugal lending, you know? Orasan. Just for a while. You know, in 2 Congresses ago, somebody was crazy enough to file a bill which precisely would make marriage, what do you call that, time dependent. So there's putting an expiry date to the marriage contract, no? A 15-year marriage, a 20-year marriage, a 10-year marriage, like getting a license or a visa. That's crazy. Nat King Cole was right. Yeah, remember what Nat King Cole said? If I give my heart, it will be completely. If I fall in love, it will be forever. Those are the two things. To give oneself completely means that there's nothing left over to give to somebody else. That's why it's monogamous. To fall in love forever, I mean, totally means also that it has no end. It will be forever. Otherwise, it's not love. Now, here I put a little bit of an aside so that you can breathe and relax a bit intellectually. Look at this. We're living in a world where people are naturally trained for what I call serial monogamy. That many times young people or people in general confuse love with being monogamous. As long as one is monogamous, that's love. You really frown at somebody who's too timing. Even boyfriend, girlfriends, or people with an MU relationship, they know that where they're in an MU or they're going steady, they're not supposed to be dating somebody else. Otherwise, they're too timing. That's monogamy. But it's not forever. That's why, you go through college. How many girlfriends do you go through college or from high school? I know about you, but I went to several girlfriends in college before I finally got into the priesthood. Because it's like that. Because that kind of a relationship is not for keeps. That's not love. That's a special kind of friendship. That's even not love in the sense that many times it's self-serving. Why do I want a girlfriend? Because I don't want to face the hassle of having to find a date every weekend. At least a girlfriend is always available for the weekend date or something like that. That's what happens in college. That's what happens with yuppies. It's not forever. For as long as it's not for keeps, it's not love yet. Can be a very strong attachment, could be a very, shall we say, a good arrangement, but it's not love. It's not conjugal love. Now, that practice of falling in love, quote unquote, one after another, is what I call serial monogamy. And it's really a wind up to the divorces mentality. Because a person who was brought up in an environment like that, where he or she said, I love you, but then broke up afterwards, gets used to the idea that you can stop loving. No, you can't stop loving. Love is unconditional. Every parent knows this. You love your children regardless of what happens to them. That's the success of the song of Freddie Aguilar, Anak. Bakit ka nagkaganyan? But the pathos, why was that song so famous in Japan? Because really it was a big hit in Japan during that time. And looking at you, most of you will be aware of what I'm talking about. I'm 71 years old. So during that time, I was very conscious already of what was happening. It was a big hit in Japan because it hit at the very core of the Japanese value of filiation, of paternity, the relationship between father and son, and how painful it is for a father if a son misbehaved. Well, love is like that. Love is unconditional. Okay. The essential properties of marriage are monogamy. Conjugal love is exhausted in one beloved. And that's why polygamy is wrong. And indissoluble, true love has no expiry date. And of course, it's open to life. That's why sexual intercourse to which conjugal love is naturally oriented is of itself fertile. That's why contraception is wrong. Now, this is the natural structure of marriage. It's not subject to human restructuring the same way that human nature is not subject to re-engineering. Nowadays, they're so crazy. This became an issue in this Olympics, the Paris Olympics, right? Remember that boxer, or those two boxers? The poor Italian gave up 40 seconds in the first round because, according to her, she had never been hit by any woman that hard. By the way, that's not the gender issue, because really, that poor opponent was really a woman. Genetically, chromosomally, she was a woman, XX. But as I said, even if the chromosomes are like that, the genetic material admit of a certain margin variation, so that this particular woman had so much testosterone that she had very, very masculine characteristics. But she was still a woman. She always considered herself a woman. She had always moved around and competed in feminine sports. But it's up to the athletic authorities to control the parameters acceptable for fair play. Imagine if one day the Chinese, because they have 1.5 billion of them, were able to put together a team of basketball who are all 8-footers. An 8-footer basketball team. They're male men's basketball. It's basketball, and they don't have any extra things. But you think they will be admitted in the Olympics? Maybe the first time, yes, but immediately afterwards, the Olympic Committee will make rules putting a limit, a height limit to basketball, because it's not fair to have people competing that way. They're abnormal already. Okay, these are the things. I'm sorry. What is this? There's an advertisement here asking me to renew my subscription. No. Now let's go to this. As I said, what we have discussed so far is the natural structure of marriage is not subject to human restructuring. What canon law and civil law have done is to express this reality in juridic terms so that it can be protected and enforced. Now, this is what is meant by the juridic structure of this reality, this natural institution, which is marriage. How that natural institution is reflected in enforceable norms, enforceable provisions, exigible, then that makes it rather juridic. You can form a union whatever way you want. But if you want it to be marriage, then it must follow the norms of what marriage is. And here's the problem. While in canon law, marriage is such an important matter because it's precisely because it's the quote unquote natural vocation of the vast majority of human beings. If you're a believer, if you read the sacred scripture, you will see that from the very beginning, chapter 1 of Genesis, that man or God created man and as woman. And it says this, for this reason, a man shall leave mother and father and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. In other words, the purpose of the differentiation of the sexes into male and female, the normal thing that should happen is that they get married. They fall in love with each other and they set up a family. Now, if that's the case, then you can imagine that in canon law, in the juridic structure of the church, an awful lot of thought, an awful lot of provisions will be dedicated to that reality because it's so crucial. In contrast, very little will be dedicated to litigation of properties and objects and monetary considerations because that's not important, very important to the church. Well, in civil law, on the other hand, this reality of marriage, even if you look at the family code, it's supposed to regulate marriage and family. Look at what the articles or the laws, the norms that are there. Most of it will have to do with property, litigation, etc., etc. Very little with marriage itself. It's a mindset. And because it's like that, it's understandable, therefore, that the way civil law or the family code will regulate marriage and how to prove that there's a real marriage will also be. And that's the core of the problem of divorce. That the reality of broken marriages, of dysfunctional marriages rather, or let's call it this, dysfunctional unions, why they cannot be declared invalid is because the family code does not have the sufficient articles or articulation grounds that canon law, on the other hand, has. And saddled with this limitation, then it finds itself helpless in the face of the reality of dysfunctional or irreparably broken marriages. And faced with that helplessness, what are we going to do with this? The facile solution is just to say, divorce, forgetting the fact that, look at this, this is important. They object that rather than improve the articles for the declaration of nullity, let's just make divorce, it's easier. Not really. Think about it. If it's going to go through a rigorous process, as it should, if you're going to declare divorce, for the same effort, for the same paperwork, for the same instruction, because that's what it's called in judicial terms, effort at instruction or time, hours in instruction of the case. You can also try it for nullity. As a matter of fact, it will be easier. Why? Because if you really follow the real grounds for divorce, then it will not be very easy to do it. The problem is there's a sleight of hand here with the effort to get divorce legislation. They keep on saying it's there, no? It's not going to be a no-fault divorce, but it's going to be a divorce which you will have to prove the fault. Unlike what's happening in the Western world nowadays, it's what you call no-fault divorce. You get a divorce just because one person doesn't want anymore, and if you don't want anymore, that's it. You get a divorce. No, the people of Congress say, I mean, the pro-divorces, they will say that's not the kind of divorce we're going to institute. It will be a fault divorce. Well, that's what they say. That's what all the divorce laws started with. But it segues through the passage of years very quickly, as a matter of fact, into no fault divorce. There's no country in the world with a fault divorce. Where you have divorce, it's a no fault divorce. It's logical. When you've broken the barrier that marriages cannot be broken, then it's just a matter of how easy or how difficult is it to break it. But it can be broken. And that's the principle that must be defended, that real marriage cannot be broken. And the reason why we have declarations of nullity in the Catholic Church is because we have the provisions to show that marriage never came about. It's not an annulment, much less is it a divorce. It's a declaration of nullity. And this is what we're going to get into now after I give you a 5-minute rest. You stretch your legs and exercise. If we were a Japanese company, we'll all rise up and bend and stretch, reach for the stars and things like that. You see, I'm a good teacher.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you very
Please
much,
get,
Father. Great. Para kaming nag-review. Thank you, Father Kim. We had a very good review about prejudicial marriage counselors. Ano,
Ruby,
classes. Yes po.
meron po akong message kay Prof. Bernadette. Prof. Bernadette, I hope you can read my
Dean.
I'll check.
Thank you po.
Hi, Dean. Are you okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So far, there's still 100.
am I talking over your heads? Am I talking too fast? Or
No,
You're great po, Father.
Father,
That's
you're
great.
doing great. It's just not too
Thank you.
fast, not too slow. It's just right.
Just right.
Everybody could catch up.
Okay, good.
Take your break too, Father. Drink water.
I have to stand up. It's not good for my back
Oh
to be
yes,
right?
really.
It's not good. Okay, just a minute.
I'm gonna pause also my recording. You've been talking for 1 hour now, Father.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good. We've given you 2 hours. So how's everyone? You can unmute
You can raise your
Wait.
hands.
and
you want to
raise your
talk.
hands po. Five minutes. 29:30. Baby Barona. June Justiniani. I'd like to welcome the participants from our member Couples for Christ, Missionaries Family for Christ, Live Life, Share Christ, Live
And
Christ, Share Christ.
Dioceses, Family and Life
Family
Commission.
and Life Commissions from several dioceses. Who else? And other guests who just came to attend this session. Thank you very much for coming.
Ate Rose, there's my question sa chat group. Sa
Oh,
chat
yeah?
box. Yeah.
Wow. Wait lang po.
Actually, sa chat, I asked all those na gusto magkaroon ng kopya ng ating recording to put their names into chat and their email addresses.
Email addresses. What are your thoughts on the possibility of spouse abuse or violence as automatic grounds for psychological incapacity for annulment or declaration of nullity if corroborated by evidence? Second question is, this question is coming from Sebastian and Dre Marcaida.
Na-mention ni Father Jim kanina yun.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the possibility of passing an alternative annulment bill to the Congress to strengthen it, with the government adopting more grounds for annulment from the Catholic Church, since the Church has better grounds in canon law? Actually, we have so many grounds in canon law on marriage. Over 100 yata yun. We'll ask Father Jim these questions later during the open forum.
Okay, your 5 minutes are up.
Okay,
Our 5 minutes are up.
go ahead po.
Okay, please mute your microphones, please.
Now let's go to what I had mentioned earlier as the juridic structure of marriage. It's the articulation of the institutional content of marriage in law. Because as I said earlier, unless something can be demanded, claimed as a right, with a due protection in court. That's what you call in legal parlance, for those of you who are lawyers out there, as the right of action. Unless something is actionable, then it's just your claim. No? You can claim whatever you want until you're blue, but if it's not actionable, you cannot demand redress from a court or from the system. But if it's actionable, then it can be enforced. Now, this is what we mean by the juridic structure of marriage. So the things that can make the ingredients for a real marriage enforceable. That's what this means. So that later on, if it doesn't work or something goes wrong, you can claim that kasi naman, hindi kami nakasal because of this or because of that. This is a two-edged sword. Why? Because if on the other hand, all the ingredients are really there, if it doesn't work, it's not because there was no marriage. It's because somebody changed his mind, is reneging on his commitments to love and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till death. And no law should enable somebody to do that. Again, no, before I move any further, we're living in a world where we try to legalize what we want to do. Baliktad yung process eh. that's, my students in law, I always tell them, don't be just lawyers, be jurists. There's nothing I hate more than the concept of lawyering, no? Or making use of the law as a profession. Hanap buhay lang yan. No? No. You have to be a jurist. You have to know what law means, what right and wrong is, what the juridic structure is, what's enforceable, what is not, and the logic behind it. If not, I illustrate this. No? You get a typical Taipan. Well, typical, maybe. Yeah, okay. Imagine a Taipan. One of these rich guys who didn't go through college, but who is very good at making money. And he wants to do something. What will he do? He'll think of something, an idea. I want to do this. Then he calls his lawyers. Okay, how can I do this? Give me the provisions that will make this legal. That's what I call lawyering. No? You're prostituting the science of law, the juridic science, which is a very high calling and a very beautiful science. You're prostituting it at the service of what somebody wants to do. Dapat baliktad. You have to look at the law first and see what are the viable legal options for whatever finality, whatever pretension you might have. Ganun dapat. Hirap nga hindi ganun eh, because we have original sin. So that's what we're up against. Now we have to help people understand this. Now let's go to the juridic structure of marriage. The juridic structure of marriage rests on three pillars. What makes it juridic, enforceable, demandable, actionable? One is capacity. The second one is consent. And the third one is form. What is capacity? Capacity is the juridically, legally defined characteristics that can enable a person to get married. Minimum requirements for getting married, therefore. Now here's the thing. Since, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, God made man and woman so that they can get married to each other. Intuitively, you see that men and women are naturally capable of getting married. The incapacity to get married would be an exception. So rather than define all the requirements for getting married, what canon law did was just to define what are these characteristics that renders a person incapable. That without this, you're capable. So true is this that in canon law, it's even called a right. The jus connubii, the right to get married, is a native human right. It's the right of anyone to get married. Because when you say right, when people say right, there's a normal thing that you hear, that for every right, there is a corresponding obligation, right? But what most people don't realize is that right and that obligation belong to two people. No? Most of the times when you say right, then I have an obligation. No. If I have a right, then somebody else has an obligation to respect this right. I have a right to this, somebody has to give me that. No? So when you say somebody has the native right to get married, oops, please mute yourselves. Yun.
Father, you got muted.
Somebody muted me. Okay, how long have I been muted?
Just a short
I
while.
think after you called out, the person was not muted.
Okay. That's fine. So capacity then. That the problem is when we say that in the generality of cases, men or human beings have the right to get married. The problem is who has the obligation to get married to them, right? So now that right to get married, the corresponding responsibility to respect that right is not a person to get married to them, but rather the system. No, you have a right to get married, and society in general, the state in general, the government has the obligation to allow you to get married. That's the thing there. It's just like the right of, I don't know, shelter, the right of shelter, the right of nourishment, the right of clothing, the right of education. All of those are fundamental human rights, right? But then who has the obligation to satisfy that right? And then you see, oh, ano, who is obliged to give me food? Who is obliged to give me shelter? Who is obliged to give me education? And you realize not a single person is obliged to do that. The state is. That's the reason why the goal of any functioning political community, any functioning state or society is to be able to satisfy the fundamental human rights of its constituents. Because that cannot be, shall we say, satisfied by the individual person. No, nobody is obliged to give me education and to give me clothes, etc. No? There's a reason why the canto boy there who gets into your backyard and steals your mangoes, claiming that he has a right to food because he's hungry, because you have a right to private property also. He can go to the Department of Welfare to demand that food and to demand that mango, but not to you as an individual or as a private citizen. So that's how this thing works. No? So therefore, going to this capacity. So canon law has defined a set of 12 characteristics that renders a person incapable of getting married. Age, there's a minimum age. Minimum age is 18. Actually, in the universal law of the church, it's 16 for girls and 14 for boys, but with the provision that the individual Episcopal Conference can raise it, and the CBCP raised it to 18 for us, for both boys and girls. You know, if it were up to me, I would make it 18 for girls and 24 for boys. Because in this country, boys take so long to mature to manhood. No, I mean, your typical 21-year-old. I mean, think about you. Will you allow your daughter to get married to a 21-year-old guy? Most 21-year-olds are irresponsible. At 24, they're still playing. No, only exceptionally are they good enough to marry your daughter. You know? But your daughter, yeah, at 18, she can get married. Women are very responsible in this country, but men are not. Pardon me, no? I mean, that's an endemic problem in Philippine society, which is another matter that I can talk about for at least half an hour, why it's like that, but I'm not going to do that. So age, and then a previous marriage, the bond of marriage. So an existing marriage renders a person incapable of getting married because he is already married. Consanguinity, a certain degree of consanguinity, etc., etc. So those are the so-called impediments, which I'm not going to go into one by one. And then you have consent. Consent is really what brings about marriage. The I do, no, the will to get married to each other. Now, as you can imagine, that's a very internal act, right? The consent, that's internal. Although for marriage to take place validly, it must be expressed externally. But it's very easy to say, I do. As people, even in church, they get married, they make those vows, right? A series of I do's in church. But here is where the cookie crumbles. Because whereas the impediments or the absence thereof are easy to prove, they can be proven with documents, whether you've been married or a certain age, etc., or whether or not you're related by blood, or all of those impediments are easily demonstrated. That's why they're subject to documentary proof. Consent is not so. And here is where canon law has centuries of jurisprudence ahead of civil law, the family code. Because of course the family code is saddled with the fact that only those things which can be seen outside easily, proven in court, can be valid or can have any juridic relevance. Well, in canon law, it has been sufficiently articulated such that the components of consent, what goes into genuine consent, are articulated into norms that can be tested in court. That's the reason why in the processes of the declaration of nullity, I'm a judge. So therefore that's my, I'm not going to say that's my day job. My day job is to be a priest and hear confessions and things like that. But my, it's not a day job, what is it? No, my weekend work is in the matrimonial tribunal. And so I do a lot of these things too. And what do you call this? The most common ground for the declaration of marriage nullity does not fall under impediments or capacity. It falls under consent, a vitiated or a defective consent. And we shall look into that later. And then the third is form, the juridical form of the celebration of marriage. It's the external manifestations to express the will to marry each other, you know. So the so-called in canon law, it's called the canonical form of marriage, which can be summarized in two, the presence of the two spouses; third, the presence of a qualified witness, qualified meaning to say a special witness, who stands in the name of the church to witness that marriage is taking place. Because the real protagonists of marriage, as you can very well imagine, are the spouses. Even in Catholic terminology, in sacramental law, sacramental theology, the ministers of marriage is not the sacred ministers. The ministers of marriage are the spouses. They're the ones who marry each other. They're the ones who bring about the sacrament. So how about the sacred minister? He's just a special witness, a qualified witness, who witnesses that marriage is taking place properly with all the requirements, etc. And then plus two more witnesses. So those are the personalities in the marriage, 5 minimum. The two spouses, the what do you call this, the qualified witness, who's either the bishop or the parish priest or any other sacred minister deputized by them, or even in the absence of sacred ministers, they can even delegate this to a layman who will be the special witness. Without, then you will have a marriage without a priest, but with a layman that has been deputized to do that, plus 2 more witnesses. So 5. That's the minimum requirement. And then other requirements for licitude, but not anymore for validity. It must be in the proper place and in the proper venue. Venue, place rather, is the geographic place. No, people must get married in their own parish in principle, although they can get married somewhere else, but with the proper delegation of their parish priest. No, I always point this out in my classes of matrimonial law. Be careful with those people getting married in all kinds of esoteric places like Tagaytay or Boracay or whatever. Because unless there's proper delegation, then those will be invalid. They may not even be registered. And if they're not registered, then they don't exist in canon law. Then 2 people were not married after all, if they were not registered properly. So be careful with these things, no? So this is the so-called canonical form. And again, there's no problem with this part. This is straightforward. This is documentary. That's easy to prove, whether it was registered, whether there were witnesses, whether there's records of it. That's easy to prove. The real, shall we say, battleground is consent. And that's where we go. What are the causes of juridic marriage nullity? When do we declare a marriage a non-marriage in church, so that it's invalid what you call ab initio, from the beginning. There was no marriage. There's no marriage to annul. There's no marriage to divorce. There's no marriage to dissolve. There was no marriage to begin with. So the declaration of marriage nullity, the ecclesiastical authority, always through a judicial process, always, never administrative, declares that a given marriage, hitherto presumed valid, was in fact invalid from the start, due to a defect in any of the three factors that juridically structure marriage, either the presence of an incapacity to contract due to an impediment or incapacity to assume, second, a defective consent, or a lack of canonical form. As I said, the incapacity in terms of the 12 impediments or the lack of canonical form, that's a no-brainer. Now, here's a little note on incapacity. Because remember what incapacities are, no? They are legally defined situations that render a person incapable. So it's something rendered by law. For example, we say that legally the law says you have to be 18. Otherwise, you're incapable of getting married. Now, if you're 17 and a half and precocious, in fact, you really are capable of getting married, especially if you're a woman, a girl. As I said, the universal law puts girls at 14. You know, the minimum age in the universal canon law for girls is 14, which means to say, therefore, a 17-year-old girl is perfectly capable of getting married normally. But just to be sure, the law says, no, it has to be 18. And below 18, ipso facto, you will be incapable of getting married. So it's defined by law. Now, one of these provisions of law that renders an incapacity is the famous Canon 1095, 1095, with 3 paragraphs, 1, 2, and 3. I'm sorry, I forgot to paste it here, but I'll just say it, no? It says, the following persons are incapable of getting married, rendered incapable by law. Number 1, those who lack the use of reason. Well, of course, if you have the use of reason, right? Either permanently, because you're insane, or you're immature, or under the influence of drugs, alcohol, right? Those who lack the use of reason. 2, those who suffer from a severe or serious lack of discretion of judgment in order to accept, mutually accept the essential obligations and rights of marriage. So if a person lacks due discretion or discretion of judgment, lack of clear thinking, in general, not necessarily in that moment when he says, I do, or when he forms the consent. If there's lack of due discretion, lack of serene judgment, in order to give and to accept the rights and obligations of marriage, is incapable. You know, this is very tricky. It's normally called in civil parlance LDD, lack of due discretion. But the canonical expression for it is a serious lack of discretion of judgment, or grave lack of discretion of judgment. What do you mean by that? I only illustrate it normally by this simple thing. The minute you can say regarding a marriage, in a case, what were you thinking? When you can say, what were you thinking? What were you thinking getting to a jerk like that? What were you thinking getting married to a girl like that? What were you thinking getting married under those circumstances? The minute you can say that, it means in your mind, intuitively, you're already judging that hindi masyadong inisip to, no? That's what grave lack of due discretion is. The thing is, it's easy to say that, but in canon law, in jurisprudence, in many sentences of the Roman Rota, that had been explained and articulated in its elements. What are the ingredients that you can see, that you can detect, you can prove in court, that points to lack of due discretion. Di ba ang ganda? Kasi madaling sabihin, hindi nag-isip, yeah, but how can you prove that in court? Well, in canon law, nahimayin na yun. No? Such things as psychological baggage, that's it, not necessarily psychological incapacity, psychological nervyoso, no? Yan tao na yan, madaling mataranta. You see? Medyo nabuntis. Pwede ba namang medyo buntis? I remember many years ago, in confession, somebody was telling me, a young lady, no, that she was medyo pregnant now. So I really laughed. What do you mean medyo pregnant? No, there's no such thing as medyo pregnant. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant, but not medyo pregnant. Anyway, so that what she meant was she suspects that she's pregnant. No, that can happen. And just because she suspects she's pregnant, she was not thinking properly, sige na nga, no, kahit na ganyan yung ugali niya, sige na, no, or whatever. Or somebody pressured by peer pressure. I had a case before, 33-year-old woman, comes from a very good family, youngest. All the older are successful in multinationals and things like that, CEOs. She's the only one who's not yet married. She type A personality, working in a bank. So biological clock ticking. And one fine summer day in a vacation, meets Prince Charming in Europe, and she gets swept off her feet, and within a month they're married. And it turns out he's narcissistic, he's a real jerk, etc., etc., and so it didn't last. So that's a typical situation of lack of due discretion. Now, the third of those three provisions is the so-called psychological incapacity. Now, what is psychological incapacity? Psychological incapacity. That's the most misunderstood because that's the only thing that was lifted from canon law by the Family Code of the Philippines, psychological incapacity. Psychological incapacity in canon law is really phrased this way: the incapacity to assume the essential obligations of marriage for reasons of a psychological nature. In civil law, ginawa na lang psychological incapacity. But there's a danger to that terminology. Because what incapacitates a person is not the psychological state. What incapacitates a person is the incapacity to assume the obligations, which is tantamount to saying the incapacity to deliver what he is committing himself to in marriage. No? You cannot commit yourself to something that intrinsically you're incapable of delivering. You see, that's the logic. But since we already said that it's a natural human ability to get married to the point that it's even a right, then to say that someone is incapable of delivering the obligations of marriage is tantamount to saying that the only reason for that must be psychological. Why? Because the only other reason, which is physical, is covered in the impediments, impotence, the incapacity to carry out the sexual act or conjugal union. That's already in the impediments. So if it's not that, it must be a psychological abnormality that makes a person incapable of loving, incapable of delivering the obligations of marriage. So that's the third of those three factors. And in law, in canon law, they were described as incapacitating qualities or impediments. They render a person incapable. So, okay. So those are the shall we say, the parameters juridically determinable, detectable, can be proven in court beyond reasonable doubt that renders a person incapable or that renders a consent invalid. And so therefore, since consent is what makes marriage, that marriage invalid. At the expense or the risk of belaboring the point, Let me go a little bit further on that. That in the declaration of nullity, what we are proving is that the consent, or rather, that the marriage did not come about. Note, that's very important, because when you say you're proving, you're demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt, so proving beyond reasonable doubt, that a marriage did not come about. So the factors, the parameters, or the phenomena to be investigated must be things or factors or conditions or environmental elements that existed at the time of the marriage, of the wedding, of the I do. Things that happen afterwards are almost irrelevant to the case unless they point to the existence of something at the moment of marriage. You know, in canon law or in matrimonial law, this is so beautifully described by the distinction between marriage in facto, the actual condition of being married, and the marriage in fieri, the coming about of marriage. The marriage in facto is what marriage is, what we studied in the first part of the first hour of this afternoon, meaning to say the nature, the finality, the ends, and the essential qualities of marriage. That's the marriage in facto. Now, the marriage in fieri is how that marriage in facto comes about. And it comes about in a meeting of the minds, in the consent, which is a human act, which needs therefore the intervention of the intellect and the will. Nobody can say I do validly without having thought about it, that's the intellect, and then freely willed it, wanted it. The intellect and the will. So therefore, in the study of the validity of the consent, one must descend to how the intellect works and how freedom works, and anything that can vitiate, vitiate, meaning to say introduce defect, undermine the quality of the intellectual process and the quality of the choice process, the volitive process, the act of the will, may affect the validity of the consent. And that's what happens in a cause for nullity. You show that intellectually something failed, or willfully something failed, violated freedom. Behind the marriage nullity cause or case due to invalid consent is either of two reasons: a lack of true judgment, no? The lack of the proper decision-making process to get married, as I said earlier, no? Hindi pinag-isipan. Look, I say lack, not defective. Thus, the act of the will to marry would have been made contrary to or without the true judgment, but rather moved. Because if it's not the intellect that moved the will to want marriage, then what moved it? Something else. You always you always will for a cause. And it would be either violence or emotion, sentiments, internal. And that's what they call a lost judgment. There was no judgment, in other words. There was no discretion of judgment. Or if it's not that, it's a faulty judgment. That's why it says severe or grave lack of due discretion to get married. And this in turn can be due to ignorance, not knowing, error, knowing but knowing wrong. There's a difference between ignorance and error. Ignorance, you know, or you don't know rather, and you know you don't know. And error is you know, but what you know is wrong. And the lack of deliberation. And that's what I call imperfect judgment. Now, there's a whole gamut of possibilities in that thinking process. One is lost, a lost judgment, indeed, or confused and unsure. You know, typical situation, no, ni susulong, atras, and not sure, pero andun na yun, nakahanda na lahat, andyan na lahat ng mga imbitado, or we distributed already the invitations, ang laki-laki ng down payment sa reception, sa restaurant. So all of those things, and the poor girl or the poor guy kahit na unclear, so bahala na nga, no? Papa sa Diyos ko na lang. You know, it's like making a building. Imagine if you're going to make a building, 10-floor building, right? And then at the last moment, you realize, mali-mali yata itong plano, mali yung calculations, or hindi po masasabord yung civil engineer, yung structural engineer. So all kinds of doubts, no? Ay, pero nakahanda na lahat. Andyan na yung loan. Andyan na yung, ano, madidibanda ako pag hindi. Sige na nga, ipapasa Diyos ko na lang. Pwede ba naman yun, no? Then that thing will collapse. And if it collapses, you can later on sue for invalid plans, invalid what? So you don't do that, right? Okay. Matrimonial consent can be vitiated in Genesis by factors affecting either or both the intellect and the will. No? I'd like to kind of belabor this point because it's important. Let me see. What are the factors that can affect the intellect? What the psychologists would say, cognitive anomalies. No? The anomalies, abnormalities in the knowing process. It could be internal, as I said, damaged use of reason or a faulty use of reason due to lack of age, lack of development, or effect of drugs, alcohol and things like that, or simple immaturity or emotions. Those are internal to the intellect, or it could be external, an error caused by fraud. You know, actually, this is more common than you think. Meaning to say, people getting married not knowing very well what they're getting into. Your typical romantic who got married, love at first blush, a hurried or no courtship whatsoever, or a courtship from distance. I just adjudicated the case, or I'm adjudicating it right now. I've written it, but still, people have to sign the. And the whole problem was, yeah, there was courtship, but come to think of it, the guy was a seaman and was always away. And also, if you add up the time that they were together and really dealing with each other, it was something like 6 months. Even if really it took almost 1.5 years, it's still 1.5 years. That's still short, no? From the time they got introduced to each other to the time they were married was more or less 1.5 years. But the actual interaction, F to F, face to face, was 6 months because the other times he was abroad. And then, sure enough, pretty soon the real characteristics of the girl came out, and she's like this, she's that. In the first place, she was so young. She was only 19, and the guy was already 30 plus, no? So, paano nangyari yun, no? So, yun. So, lack of due discretion, lack of error. Now, here's the thing with error. In canon law, there are articles, there are norms that says this. Error regarding a person invalidates marriage, invalidates consent, meaning to say, you got married to the wrong person. Pwede mo naman yun, you got married to the wrong person. Yeah, pwede, no? Especially nowadays, people magliligawan through text, magliligawan through Viber, magliligawan through a long-distance relationship. Or, more baroque situation, here's a case of identical twins. You fell in love with one and then you got married to the other. So the wrong twin, right? So things like those can happen. So it seems bizarre. How can you get married to the wrong person? Well, you can, and it has happened. So, however, error regarding equality of a person will not invalidate consent. Unless, here's the unless, it's about a quality that is directly willed, without which one would not have married. So talagang magpapakasal lang ako if a person is a virgin, for example. And you thought the person was a virgin, then later on you discovered hindi pala a virgin. If you want to sue for nullity, you can. Worse is if the quality, if the error is caused because of fraud, that the person deliberately misrepresented himself or herself regarding a quality which of itself could cause difficulty in conjugal life. You see how articulated this is? You'll never find something like that in the family code. But in canon law, it is there. If somebody withheld a quality, a characteristic that of itself makes married life difficult for the purpose of getting consent, then that's invalidating. If that can be proven in court afterwards, then you can get a declaration of nullity. Now, what are these? For example, masyado ka maraming utang pala, So you're going to enter marriage with hanggang dito utang, or you have anak sa labas na hindi mo sinabi, or you're a secret agent, you're a spy of the Chinese, or I don't know what, you're a sleeper agent, and things like those. Or even the thing of virginity that I said earlier. If that really matters to the person and ask, are you a virgin? And somebody said yes, and then she's not. Well, that's ground for nullity. So these are the things, because you look at it, it's common sense. Because will or consent is what goes into marriage. So therefore, if there are things that can affect the quality of that consent, it should, if it can be proven in court, be grounds for the declaration of nullity. Okay? Now, what are the factors affecting the will? There can be internal factors like fear. Yeah. The typical omnia parata sunt, or an arranged marriage, or the typical situation where a girl gets pregnant and is not really ready to get married, or this is just a casual affair, but oops, she gets pregnant, and will put so much shame on the family and will displease her parents. So sige na nga. So she she gets married under those circumstances. Well, that invalidates the marriage. Or external violence. So that's the typical shotgun marriage. It doesn't have to be shotgun. And by the way, this fear, the notion of fear, it is externally caused. It doesn't even have to be, shall we say, deliberately caused. Meaning to say someone may be, because fear, where is fear? Fear is very subjective. It's the person who's contracting who is afraid. Maybe the person causing that fear did not really want to cause it. I have a wonderful slide on this where you have a person in a shotgun marriage, so to speak, because the father has a shotgun, but not because to coerce him to saying yes, but he had a shotgun because he was going to go duck hunting and he was in a hurry because the ducks are flying, so poor guy was pressured to saying yes just because the father-in-law had a shotgun with that was not the intention of the father-in-law, but it produced fear. If it can be proven that it produced fear and he was afraid and there's a reason for him to say yes, and that's a ground for nullity. Now, after seeing all of this, what are the things that come to mind? And what comes to mind are the following. That what is needed more than, and here I'm going to share with you another stop share. You are in sharing mode. Share. I will share this instead. I'm sorry. Do you see my slide, my new slide? You see it, right?
Not yet, Father.
No, no, not yet.
There are three things that need to be introduced to the family code to make it more, shall we say, agile in declarations of nullity. Because as I said, what is needed is not a divorce bill that will affect all marriages, but rather measures to make declaration of nullity more agile and more accessible to everyone faster so that troublesome marriages can be declared null. And the only things that will fall out of this, they cannot be declared null because they were really valid, will therefore be cases of what? Somebody reneging on his commitments. And no law should be passed to let him get away with that. No, it's just like the legalization of abortion or the legalization of marijuana or drugs or the legalization of prostitution. I mean, those are very bad measures. You shouldn't legalize something which is wrong. At least we can regulate it. Yeah, the way to regulate it is not to let it happen. That's the way to regulate it, not to let it happen in a more, shall we say, reasonable way. Like what happened with abortion in England. There was a time in the 1990s, early 90s, when there was a lot of discussion regarding abortion in England because it was already, because they had abortion. And the gist of the argument was how to make abortion more painless for the fetus. what what absurdity, no? I mean, you're going to end his life, but at least don't make it painful for him. So that was the thing. That's crazy, no? So that's exactly what happens with the legalization of abortion, the legalization of divorce, the legalization of homosexual unions or marriage. All of these are wrong behaviors, wrong acts, and you're trying to legalize it. Well, you should not legalize anything that's wrong. Rather, offer an alternative solution, and this is the alternative. No? So the lack of due discretion of judgment is one of the most common grounds for the declaration of marriage nullity in church tribunals. It's based on the invalidity of a marriage consent that stemmed from a defective judgment at the moment of giving consent due to the incidence of immaturity, error, deceit, fear, and even psychological factors in the decision-making process. It's quite obvious why such a defective decision to marry could later on lead to an irreparably broken marriage. That is, such a marriage had no leg to stand on in the first place. So again, don't legalize divorce, which will affect all marriages. Make it possible to detect this defect and to declare that such a marriage is invalid from the start. Then the other thing is
Father?
simulate.
Excuse me, Father. Do you have me
Yes.
change to your slide?
You haven't changed my slide.
Yeah, that
I
was
thought,
still on the consent.
okay, okay, because I changed the screen that I'm sharing. It seems like that didn't happen. Let me
Stop
see.
share, Father, and then
I have to
reshare.
stop share first.
Yes, po.
And I just
Okay.
change just like that, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
opo.
I was trying to do a shortcut and that didn't work, obviously. So let's change that. Uh-huh. So there. Share. And then share. Share. Get it? Do you have it now?
Yes, Father. Yes, po.
Okay.
It's highlighted in green.
Yes. I'll just increase your size so I can see you. There you are. Yes, I have three screens in front of me, you know. So the lack of due discretion, we saw that. And now let's even have a touch screen here. So simulation. Now, what is simulation? Another very common thing. Simulation occurs Let me just increase the size of this so that you can read it easier. Yeah. Simulation occurs when a couple goes through the external motions of a wedding ceremony, but without the intention of entering into the institution of marriage. Kung wari nagpapakasal, but in their mind, hindi naman sila nagpapakasal. Now, that can be done two ways. Either ayaw nila talaga magpakasal, or ayaw nila ng isang essential quality of marriage. So the exclusion of one of the essential qualities of marriage, and what are the essential qualities of marriage again? There are three, remember? Number one, indissolubility. Number two, monogamy. And three, openness to life. So if any of those three is excluded internally, then that marriage is what you call simulated. An example is a marriage of convenience for the purpose of facilitating immigration, but without the intention of living together as husband and wife. Less extreme cases are those of a couple who, at the time of the wedding, had the intentions of excluding an essential property of marriage, such as procreation. The couple does not want to have children at all, or unity, cases of open relationship, and indissolubility. The couple is open to the possibility of divorce. Marriages tainted by simulation are void for the same reason that absolutely simulated contracts are void under Article 1409 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, because the couple did not enter into the marriage contract in the first place. Now, this is not in the civil legislation, but it can very well be included for this reason. If marriage is a contract, then it should follow the requirements for a valid contract. And one of the invalidating factors for a contract is this, Article 1409 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, the Philippine Civil Code. On the other hand, here's a third one. A person who contracts marriage inveigled by deceit, perpetrated in order to secure consent concerning some quality of the other party, which of its very nature can seriously disrupt conjugal life, does so invalidly, means the marriage or consents invalidly. Such is the case, for example, of a person who marries a person who has hidden the fact of his or her homosexuality or criminal status, or having dependent children out of wedlock, or drug addiction, or other such characteristics. There are other incidences of defective consent, which the Code of Canon Law recognizes as grounds for nullity of marriage, and which could similarly be imported into Philippine law. This could cover all the truly meritorious cases of irreparably broken marriages with irreconcilable difference. That is to say, all cases of marriages which were really void ab initio. I say almost, because the only exceptions would be those which are valid, and as I said, for the nth time now, therefore, people who want a divorce for that really just want to renege on their commitments, and no law should justify such a heinous act of reneging on your commitments. Finally, a change of terminology would really help clarify the issues. A glaring point is to do away with the difference in the family code between void and voidable marriages, such that marriages tainted by fraud, violence, undue intimidation, etc., would not be merely voidable, as they're called now in the family code, but rather void ab initio. Because if you think about it, what's the difference between void and voidable? For those of you who are lawyers, there's one of the discussions that I hope you got into. And if not, well, I just wish you were in my class instead in matrimonial law, because I really believe at this point that the difference between void and voidable is absolutely, pardon me again, because I don't mince words with these things, stupid. One consequence of this is that under Article 39 of the same code, the parties to such marriages will still have a remedy available even beyond the 5-year limit currently imposed under Article 47 of that code, and would not be limited to psychological incapacity under Article 36 of that code to have their marriages declared null and void from the start. And here's a little aside. Unfortunately, as I said, when the family code was crafted as a concession, because some people wanted divorce, but okay, that's divisive and it's against the values. And besides, we were under Cory Aquino at that time, so they instead imported something from the Code of Canon Law, and I have it in my conscience that at that time when I was consulted by the nunciature, no less, how that family code was, I said, no, it's okay. It's taken from the Code of Canon Law. At that time, I was very young. I was a very young priest. I didn't have enough experience. That little did I realize that, yeah, it was taken, but taken very defectively. No? They just got Article 3, Canon 1095, paragraph 3, precisely the so-called psychological incapacity. And it just so happens that that particular ground is one of the least used grounds in nullity cases. Because I always say this, no? That normally, for the greater part, people are psychologically normal. Because it's a curve, di ba? The so-called normal curve. The bell, it's also called the bell curve. For those of you who have taken the statistics in college or in high school, it's called a bell curve, or it's called the Gaussian curve, no? The Gauss curve. It's like that. That the great part of the population is there in the normal, and then there are very few incidences in one side or the other of normalcy. It is normalcy, no? So the great there are there, either under normal or sobra normal, no? But then the little symptotic curve there at the ends, very few people are abnormal psychologically. That the preponderant majority are normal. So therefore, psychological abnormalcy as a ground for a dysfunctional marriage will seldom happen. Now, unfortunately, precisely that's the only thing that was imported by the family code. Ano nga mangyayari? So they have to massage everything to that thing, which is not real, by the way. So many of the declarations of nullity in civil courts is moral, psychological incapacity. I once adjudged a case in the ecclesiastical tribunal that had been adjudged in civil court already, and on the ground of psychological incapacity because the husband was homosexual. I remember interviewing the driver, no? May napansin ka bang, kabadingan dun sa boss mo? The guy told me, Father, wala. Actually, ang problema talaga dyan, kung saan sa ang beer house ko nga siya hinahatid. Dahil babaero talaga yung boss ko, no? So, the problem was the opposite, no? Then when I interviewed the guy, I asked him, ba't ganun? And then you know what he told me? Well, I wanted out. I got a lawyer. And that's what they said. And he made the case based on that. Ewan ko, paano yung ginawa yun? Very easy. You get a psychological evaluation. You pay the person and you get it. That's the reason why civil nullity or annulment cases are so expensive. The typical package for annulment in civil court is 300,000 pesos. Papataas. I have a client who has already spent 600,000 pesos, hindi pa rin niya makuha-kuha because he happened to be raffled off to a judge who considered herself a very good Catholic, daily mass goer, and she systematically was making all kinds of problems because she didn't want to grant an annulment in court. So delay. Actually, it was already the lawyer na awa na sa kanya and say, Sir, awa na ako siyo, 600,000 na, wala pa rin nangyayari. Let's just drop this case. let some time pass and refile it in another tribunal. And that's what exactly happened. No? So that's the problem. And that's what's in the mind of the pro-divorce camp. They see that reality, ang hirap-hirap kumuha ng declaration of nullity or annulment, mas madali itong divorce. So what we need to do is to offer a solution, not to go into the immorality of abortion, or rather of divorce, or the church position. That's old. That's old argument. No, you can argue that until you're blue. Hindi tatalab yun because there's a problem. So you have to address that problem, no, and not argue in a different reason, no, separation of church and state. No. Now, another step in the same direction would be the consistent use of the expression declaration of nullity of marriage instead of annulment of marriage. In the former, the competent tribunal is rectifying the fiction of law, fictio juris, created by the celebration of a marriage with due form, but which is subsequently proven in a judicial process to suffer a defect in the consent or even in the capacity of one or both contractants. By declaring it null ab initio, in this case, there's no annulment, which would be tantamount to divorce or to the dissolution of a valid marriage bond, because the court precisely declares that such a marriage never existed. There's nothing to annul. Absolute divorce proponents frequently cite the expensive and tedious process of obtaining a declaration of marriage nullity. Here again, canon law provides a model in Pope Francis's Motu Proprio Mitis Judex Dominus Iesus, promulgated in 2015. Because among the reforms that it introduced was a so-called briefer process for cases where both parties are in agreement to file for a declaration of nullity. So there's no contest, in other words, and the presence of certain circumstances which, while not of themselves grounds for the nullity of marriage, are indicators, they're indicative, that such a nullity may be of easy judicial demonstration, easy instruction, therefore, easy proof. So therefore, such cases can be done in the so-called expedited or briefer process. Just one meeting. You know, I have made I think I hold the record in the briefer process with the Diocese of Antipolo. Once we adjudged the case in 2 days, because it is clear cut. Everything is there, just one trial, no objections. And but mo papahabain if it's clear, no? So therefore, we were able to do it. So it's not true that a good process, a thorough process, need to be long and tedious and expensive. What you need are the right frameworks for doing it quick, clear, and inexpensive. And it can be done. That's why church process, normally, even without the briefer process, what's the cost of a church process? In Manila, 60,000, even 40, and in the provinces, even cheaper. While versus the civil case, it's 300,000 from the beginning. Given the ample range of possibilities and options provided by the proposed reforms discussed above, the legislation of absolute divorce becomes unnecessary to address truly meritorious cases of irreparably broken marriages. So with that, I end my presentation to give us some time for the open forum.
Thank you very much, Father Jim. It's like you've given the entire semestral that we've learned from the prejudicial in 2 hours. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank
Actually,
you very much.
we choose the course, Father, the topic, because we've read your opinion in a Daily Inquirer, in the newspaper,
Yes.
trusting the church wisdom on void marriages. Na meron tayong pwedeng alternative in case instead of divorce, but we have just to weaponize the family code of the Philippines, Father. Okay, meron po tayong mga questions, Father. Can we have it?
Yeah,
Oh,
one
please.
question.
There's
Yes.
64 entries in the chat.
Father, there's one question here. What are your thoughts on the possibility of spouse abuse or violence as automatic grounds for psychological incapacity for annulment if corroborated by due evidence?
Okay.
That's the first.
So let's answer that question by question, no? Because otherwise I'll forget what you just said. Let
Yes.
me answer that first. It's very important, for us to realize that a declaration of nullity looks at the marriage in theory, the coming about of the marriage, and we're showing that it did not come about. So the things that happen afterwards are almost irrelevant to that process, unless they are, meaning to say that what happened afterwards shows the state of mind, the quality of the person, etc., when he said, I do. That's why anything like that that happens afterwards cannot be automatic. It must be connected. It must be shown that that situation of spousal abuse, whatever, was present at the time of marriage. When you say, for example, spousal abuse, which can be shown by with evidence, that shows you how the guy is after the marriage. But does that show anything about how he was before the marriage? That must be demonstrated. And that's what should happen in court. And that can be demonstrated if you show that that's a continuing pattern, that when they were dating, it was already violent, that as a as a normal, I mean, as a person, he tended to solve problems in a violent way, talagang brusco, talagang basagulero, or whatever. And in order to do that, you will need witnesses to say that.
Yes.
So you must establish the pattern of spousal abuse as a characteristic of that person even before marriage.
Yes, Father. Thanks. There's another question. This is coming from Sebastian Marcaida. What are your thoughts on the possibility of passing an alternative annulment bill to the Congress to strengthen it with the government adopting more grounds for annulment from the Catholic Church, since the Church has better grounds in canon law?
Sure. Definitely, I'm all for that. As a matter of fact, it's just good for you to know because you should know who your friends are in the same way you should know who your enemies are.
Yeah.
That there's a move in Congress, spearheaded by Tingog party list representative Jude Asidre. They have a bill. It's co-authored by three, and it's fantastic. It's if it were really up to me, I would give a total reworking of that section of the family code so that the articles are arranged the way I presented it, that the three different legs of the juridical structure of marriage, if they could be separated that way so that it's obvious, it's clear, so that even lawyers don't just memorize things, but it's an aid to memorization. When you have a structure in your head, then you can memorize it better because there's a structure. Unlike now, it's just a hodgepodge of norms, reasons for this, and there's no system to it. There must be a system. If it were up to me, I'd do that. But it's also true that the Congress would be more resistant to a total recrafting rather than just introducing small changes here and there. As long as the essential things not included will still be included. And there's a bill like that in the works. So if you hear about it, Jude Asidre and company, the bill to enlarge the grounds for nullity, that's the thing to support. No, I mean, I recommend that you support.
Okay, how about Father po? There's a bill filed by former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo giving civil effects to nullified degrees from the Catholic Church.
From
Yes.
the Catholic
From the
Church
Catholic
only.
Church. Catholic Church
Yeah.
only.
Okay, that's an old idea. The first bill filed that way was filed by
Saul
Father
Aragones.
Monsignor Baluma in
Ayan.
1898, the so-called Baluma Bill, and proposal, and that's good, but you have to be realistic, because I immediately see difficulties with that, because how can you grant that to the Catholic Church? I mean, without falling right smack in the forces of separation of church and state. Mind you, when we, these changes that we're proposing, or I'm proposing for the family code, it's not on the ground that they are canon law. As a matter of fact, if you can introduce them without mentioning canon law, better. But even if you did mention, their point of argument, or their rationality, their what do you call this, the force with which they can be, or they should be carried, is not because they're proposed by the church, but rather they make good juridic sense. It just so happened that the church thought of them first. You can say that the Newtonian mechanics is an English law of physics. So I hate everything English, and the French won't accept it because it's English. Well, no, his big English has nothing to do with it. It just so happened that Newton was from England. In the same way, I hate Cartesian calculus because I don't like the French. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not accepting calculus because of or Leibniz for that matter. I don't like the Germans, so I don't want differential calculus because it's by a German. No, it's not like that. No, it makes sense. Now, when you do something like that, it's so, at your face, it's favoring the Catholic Church. The next thing that will happen is, why not favor also the Sharia law? Why not favor whatever other religion there? Maybe the self-proclaimed Son of God has his own code for matrimonial law, the Kibuloy law of marriage and family, and why not that? No, that's the next thing, and that will be problematic.
Okay, thank you very much, Father. By the way, if anybody who would like to ask question, you may just
Unmute.
raise your hands and I'll call on you. There's another question. There's another question here, Father. How about people in the autistic spectrum?
Mhm.
Do they have the capacity for marriage?
Well, it's called the spectrum. It's not called the spectrum, rather, for nothing, because a spectrum is a spectrum. No, there are grades depending on how they are. They may be, but the entrada, I would say, they're severely challenged for that, because part of that spectrum precisely is the inability to process the environment, or what comes in from the environment, and vice versa, to relate to it. And marriage is conjugal love, that is intimately, or what's they call that? Imminently, rather, not intimately, imminently relational. And the problem of the autistic spectrum is the problem of relation. How can you relate? But if you can show that they are capable, then they're capable. That's the reason why this is important. The so-called incapacity to assume for reasons of psychological nature cannot be judged by a psychologist. The one who judges that is the tribunal. The input of the psychologist, which is important, is just to describe what that person is who's suffering the psychological anomaly, what are the manifestations, etc., etc. But then to make the connection that such characteristics, such psychological abnormality is connected to the capacity to give and to accept the rights and obligations of marriage, that's up to the
Okay,
judge. So to
Father, thank you very much.
the judge.
Okay. Thank you, Father. Another question we have here is from
Okay.
Olivia.
I'd like to add one more thing regarding
Okay.
autism. No? Years ago, when I was a chaplain of a private school, we had a couple of children, boys, who were very nice, but they belonged to the spectrum. So they would go to school, they were being mainlined, they had their own caregivers, and the time came for First Communion. Hmm. They were 2 or 3 years behind their classmates because precisely they're autistic. But okay, but they were normal enough, so to speak. They pray, they could understand what communion was. Okay, so now the whole batch was being prepared for First Communion. So the part of the preparation for First Communion is First Confession, right? And that became a problem. Why? Because these poor kids, these kids, they're beautiful children, just didn't have any idea of what sin was. They didn't have the consciousness of sin because they're good. They just do what they know is the right thing and they avoid what they so they're like that. So they're not conscious of having done anything contrary to what they think is right and wrong. So therefore I found myself at a loss as a priest how to hear their confession. They couldn't accuse themselves of anything. Thank God, I came across literature that says precisely the degree of maturity necessary to appreciate the difference between normal bread and the Eucharistic host and wine, etc. To understand that here there's some transubstantiation. The degree of maturity needed for that is a lot less than the degree of maturity needed to differentiate moral behavior and immoral behavior. So they were mature enough, they had sufficient intellect to go to communion, but they couldn't go to confession. You see, that's what happens with autism. That's a gray area that's very very peculiar, very very personal, very very individual, and it's up to the judge to or to the priest, to the parish priest, to determine. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Father. There's another question here. Any reason as to why there is no collaboration, integration of canon law into the present laws on nullity of marriage in the Philippines?
Yeah, separate the so-called poorly understood separation of church and state, together with an increasing laicist mentality. There was a time, up to now, it happens most of the time, that when a cop or anyone sees me, if I roll down the window, that I'm a priest driving, then I get all the consideration. It's called, somebody called it the cast of power. No? But of late, I'm noticing that less and less people really mind that. No? I just got into an accident along EDSA 2 weeks ago, little fender bender, and the owner was at the beginning a little bit belligerent, and even when I said I'm a priest, to him it didn't matter. You know, I think he was it looked like he was a mason or something like that. So that's what's happening here. You know, a laicist mentality that just abhors, without saying so, anything Catholic. So that's the reason, even if it's already common sense. It's lack of intellectual, in the end, it's lack of intellectual integrity. It's nominalism carried to the max, no? Legal positivism is the bane of our age. Actually, at the end of the day, the reason behind that is, or the logic behind that is, the reason for the exigibility of laws, according to this mentality, is the will of the legislator. And if the legislator doesn't want, he doesn't want, period. But as you know very well, that's not the correct juridic sense of law. The exigibility of a law is because that's the way things are. That's the reason why you can demand them. Not the other way around. I can demand them, and so therefore that's the way they will be. Oops. So there's something wrong in right? Any clear thinking individual will see that. But there are many people who are not clear thinking. I once had a tussle with the dean of a prestigious university. They even pride themselves as the best law school in the land. Because can you imagine, he had the effrontery to say that the declaration of nullity is just a legal fiction. It's actually divorce. When we know that these people are really divorcing and we're calling it declaration of nullity, calling a declaration of nullity a legal fiction. I was trying to explain, but it wouldn't get through his head. It was the dean. That what happened here is rather the other way around, that the law, the juridic system, created the fiction in this marriage, this specific marriage. And not really with malice, but it did, in the sense that the form was given, the witnesses were there, they expressed their consent, the requirements documentary were met, so a marriage took place. That's a fiction, because now you recognize, there were defects, there were ingredients that weren't there, we didn't know, now we know, and we can demonstrate it. So now what happens in the declaration of nullity is the tribunal repairs the fiction that it had created, what do you call this, carelessly, saying that there's no marriage. So the fiction is the marriage. The declaration of nullity is the rectification of that fiction, so that it agrees now with reality, that in reality there was no marriage, you see. But not very many people, or some people don't want to think that way. Okay.
Okay.
And as I said, it was
Thanks,
a deep.
Father. Okay, that's also from TP Rosario. I'll just simplify the questions. Those who have prenuptial agreement and are not really married.
Okay, it's like this. One of the impediments, these are impediments, remember? These are the legally established characteristics or situations that renders a person incapable of getting married. And one of those is this, provision. A condition of the future invalidates marriage.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Condition of the future. Now, try to understand what condition
Sure.
is. A condition is not a provision to do something. A provision to do something, well, that's valid. If you want to bind yourself to do something in the future, then you're perfectly. No, a condition is like a foundation for something that this marriage, this I do, this consent, the constitution of this marriage depends on this condition. But this condition happens to be something that can only be verified in the future. It's like saying, I will marry you provided you pass the bar exams next year.
Mhm.
Now, that condition, that kind of a prenup, invalidates the marriage. Why? Because the condition on which the consent is built is not yet there. That will only become valid when he has passed the bar exam. Okay? A different matter if I marry you, but we make the condition that you try your darndest best to pass the bar exam next year. Well, that's a different story. That he will try his darndest best to pass the bar exam. But not that he will pass the bar exam, because he doesn't know if he will pass. You cannot put that as a condition. No?
Yes.
Now, most of prenups belong to that other class, what I say, that they bind themselves to act a certain way in the future. And what is this? That all the monies that I bring in here before marriage will not enter in our conjugal property. Well, that's perfectly valid if they both agree on that. But what they're gonna do is that what happens within the marriage will still be separate. No, that's not right, because in conjugal life, the two in one flesh make of these lives one life, etc., etc. So such a condition will invalidate the marriage. So that's why I say when people have prenups, be careful what the prenups are. Yes. And the
Yes.
priest should be bright enough to get into that, you know. Okay.
Thank you, Father. We have a question from Brother Robbie Shalcita. Please
Yeah,
unmute.
Robbie. Robbie, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Hi, Father. I really wanted to attend this actually. Uh,
I hope
well,
so.
well, I have a colleague who has been separated from her husband for over 10 years. And the reason behind it was because when they got married, the husband actively had a mistress. So she
Okay.
found out during the marriage, and so they just went their separate ways. So obviously there was already that kind of an impediment. It could be grounds for a declaration of nullity, but it seems that she's not been able to work on it because of financial concerns. So 10 years after, she's still married both legally and in the church. So what advice can I give her? Because and now her husband doesn't even return any messages. She can't call him, she can't reach him.
Okay.
So what
First of
advice
all,
can I get her? Because obviously she supports divorce because it's easier if once
mm,
the bill is passed.
okay. Now, that's a matter of opinion whether it will be easier. No. Now, the first thing that you have to disabuse her is of rather is to think that that fact of having a mistress when they were married is an impediment. It's not. It's not. There's no. That's not one of the impediments. No.
Okay.
Now, there could be a ground though, and it's not the impediment. It's the ground again. No, this is where the richness of canon law comes in. The ground of vitiated consent. That when she gave her consent, she didn't know that thing. That there was an ongoing thing. So lack of due discretion. In this particular case, you could even put it in more, shall we say, mundane terms, lack of due diligence, no, on her part. She got married to a womanizer. Or maybe he's not a womanizer. Maybe that's another thing that will have to be proven. It was just that he had a mistress at that time, but which
Mm-hmm.
or who rather he might have dismissed because precisely they were getting married or soon after they got married. It depends on what the situation were, you know. But just don't say that it was an impediment because it's not. But I'm not saying there's no
Okay.
ground because the way she describes it, and maybe more of it can come if she talked with the right person, that really there's ground for either lack of due discretion on her part or even lack of due discretion on his part. If you're really like that, then why marry? No,
Mm-hmm.
what were you thinking when you got married? Because marriage is a lifetime commitment, one on one, totally. So were you like that? Or there's another ground here, simulation. It could be simulation because he was saying, I do to what? To the content of marriage. Total self-giving, exclusive, and which is monogamous, and indissoluble. When at the back of his head, he was maintaining a relationship. That's simulation. You see, there are several grounds here, depending on which is easier to prove, given the conditions and the available proof, the available evidence rather, the available evidence, whether it can constitute proof. There's a difference, you know, in law. Um, what ground you will use. But hearing what so far, I'm not closing my mind. There is really a possibility.
Yes, Father. Next
Thank you,
question.
Father.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you, Robbie. Brother
Bobby.
Robbie.
We have another question from Brother Wayne. Yes, Paul. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ate Ruby. And good afternoon once again, Father Jim. Was a very nice presentation. And one of the key points that I thought I understood coming from your presentation was that maybe we should be doing something that will prevent the recurring theme of the Congress.
Mhm.
Like once in every Congress, there is a move to pass a divorce bill. And
Yes.
I'm not sure how that can be possibly executed. I'm thinking that we should be like campaigning for legislators who are really against this kind of an action. But of course, that's a kind of very difficult. So I'm thinking, can we actually question the the deliberation of this bill with the Supreme Court? But I'm thinking that maybe the Supreme Court will say this is premature action. There is nothing to act on it yet because the law is not yet
Action.
passed. But
Yeah.
in what possible way can we actually execute this, Father Jim? How can we, is it every start of the Congress we go to the Senate and to the House and do the lobbying at the first day? Or maybe you have something in mind, Father, na we can be we can do so that we can be more effective in the process.
Okay, definitely. First of all, you're right in saying that the Supreme Court will not act on this because there's nothing yet. No,
Yes.
there's the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution of prior restraint. You don't restrain something before it's even done. No? So the move that I really support is what I stated earlier. In Spanish, there's a saying, muerto el perro, se acabó la rabia. No? That with the dog dead, that's the end of the danger of rabies. No? So remove the reason for um, the divorce bill. And what is the reason? The legitimate reason, because there's an illegitimate one. The illegitimate one is that those people really want a divorce because they want to renege on their commitments. There's nothing we can do about that motive. It's there, but it should be denied. But there are so many others who really have a valid, in law you call it a pretension, an aim, no, a finality, a goal that they're trying to accomplish, which is to address the reality of irreparably broken or very dysfunctional marriages. And what you can do with that is what I said, to establish more grounds so that you can process those things properly. So therefore, the amendments to the family code, in order to increase the grounds and to facilitate the declaration of nullity, because majority of the cases of dysfunctional or irreparably broken unions are really cases of null or invalid marriages, and they should be declared so.
I see, Father. So that means that the better way really is to support the move, the latest move of Congressman Jude of the Tingog Party List and his team,
That's
and
it.
other co-sponsors to really seriously get support alliance on this move to amend the family code.
I strongly advocate and support that.
Yeah. Thank you, Kuya Wayne. Thank you, Father. Father, there's another question here. If a husband lied to his wife regarding his educational qualification, like he's supposed to be just an elementary graduate, well, he told his wife that he was a second-year college undergraduate. However, during the time of their marriage, the wife saw that the husband was really very uneducated, and also he also curses his wife every now and then. So what do you think about that? Is it nullifiable? Is it a ground for nullification?
Okay. Remember, the ground is to withhold or to misrepresent yourself regarding equality, which of itself makes conjugal life difficult, no? Very difficult. Now, of itself, lack of education, in terms of academic education, does not make a conjugal life very difficult of itself. But in that particular case, it's not just of itself, there are other attendant things there. It's really not only uneducated academically, he's even boorish. No? If he's cursing and things like that, is It's a, you know, there's no other term for it. He's a jerk, right? So now, what will be the ground to prove
Fraud.
that that information was withheld for the purpose of getting marital consent?
Mhm.
It's not easy to prove that because you have to get into the mind of the other party. What was in his mind? What was he thinking? Was he really withholding this information? Was he fooling the other party? You can do that. But it's much easier to prove lack of due discretion on his part, on her part rather, no? Akala ko, no, the minute you can say, what were you thinking? Ba't mo pinakasalan yan, no? Well, hindi ko alam ganyan ano. That's lack of due discretion. Lack of due discretion is such a wide thing, no? So many marriages are dysfunctional because of this. Hindi ka nag-isip nung pinakasalan mo yan, no? Kulang yung pag-iisip mo. Hindi mo inisip na mabuti. Yun.
Father, was there any prescribed period with regards to filing of nullity with that
Kind of.
kind of reason or
That's the right
ground?
thing. That's the nice thing about this, no? Of making it part of the family code, because part of the difference between void and voidable marriages is the prescription. So
Mhm.
by identifying the two, that if these characteristics are there, they're void from the very beginning. And if they're void from the very beginning, there should be no prescription.
Mhm.
Because if they were void
Mhm.
at the beginning, they're
Yes,
still void
yeah.
up to now. We just have to declare it. No? So because
Whether
that
there's another. Oh, yeah, go ahead, po. Sorry.
the distinction of void and voidable is like I don't know what, no? I mean, nagustuhan lang niya na these are the voidable and these are the void. There's no logical, juridically defensible reason why one is voidable or the reasons for voidable and void ab initio. They're the same.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, po. Okay, we have another question from Brother Demi. Kuya Demi? Go ahead, please.
Father, can we consider that this
Kasi,
parang ab initio, deceit
I'm sorry.
case? Deceit, Father, that's deceit because he mentioned that he his second year college.
Yeah, but you cannot prove because an important element in deceit is the intention to deceive for reasons of getting a consent. It's hard to prove that. No? Was that his intention? O bukang
Yes.
bibig lang, o nagyayabang lang, no? That I'm a college graduate. But if he did it for the purpose of getting a consent para mapasagot niya, how do you prove that? It's a difficult thing.
Okay. Father, there's another question here, kaya lang baka may matamaan tayo. Father, she doesn't want to be mentioned. Father, isn't the priest given the responsibility to detect if the couple is capable of entering the sacrament of marriage?
course.
So, because he said that pre-Cana cannot possibly detect that.
Well, it's like this. The pre-Cana seminary in itself may not be able to detect it,
Yes.
but the canonical investigation should, to a
Should.
large extent, because the canonical investigation by the parish priest, the interview, in other words, should get to the hard questions. Now, if the pre-Cana is done properly, it should contain in itself elements that should make the parties ask themselves these hard questions. So
Mhm.
that's the reason why the pre-Cana cannot be half a day, cannot even be a day. In AIM family, the outfit I'm involved in,
Sweet.
we have 2 days of pre-Cana, and even that is too short. It should be longer. You know what the syllabus presented by the Vatican? has enough for 20 months. Because they took it from the proposal of the Spanish Episcopal Conference that had enough for 2 years. Because according to the Spanish bishops, if it takes 4 years to prepare yourself to become an architect, an engineer, or a lawyer, it should take as much time to prepare yourself to get married, which is the most important thing you can do in your life, rather than construct buildings. So in AIM
Yes, Father.
family, what we're doing is, since nobody is willing to do that for a pre-K na, what we have is a 2-day pre-K na, morning and afternoon with Zoom, and then enough materials for monthly meetings, even though it's recorded and you can do it asynchronously, but you can also do it as a group for the next 5 years to accompany a couple with all the issues that were included in that original syllabus of 20 months, but to be covered for the next 5 years. Because at least if they cannot be exposed to that before they got married, okay, at least you make sure that they're helped, accompanied in the next 5 years. Because statistics show that majority of the breakups or marital breakdowns happen in the first 5 to 10 years of marriage. Anybody who weathers the 10 years will weather for the next of their married life. So somebody who celebrates the 10th anniversary is statistically will celebrate the 50th if they're alive.
Yes, Father. Father, we'll be limited to just 2 more questions.
Okay.
One is a follow-up question from Mr. Robbie Shalsita. Father, what can we say to those who would like to apply for nullification and annulment in the civil court about their complaint about the cost?
Too expensive.
It's too expensive. What can we possibly tell them?
Too expensive where? In the civil court?
Yeah, in the church and the civil court, both.
In the first place, you have to tell them that it's not true that the process in church is expensive.
Yes,
It's
correct.
only the provinces at 60. The civil court is expensive. It's at least 300,000, at least. No?
Yeah.
So the only thing is those two are not on, they're separate. What is declared null in one is not automatically declared null in the other, unfortunately. No? But it's not true that it is expensive in church because Francis has even decreed that in case of real need, meaning to say they really can't afford, that the process of declaration of nullity in church should be free. And it's like that. They're free.
That's correct po. Yes, Father.
For the information po, sa Diocese of Navadijas po, we
Only charge
only charge
30,000.
30,000 donation.
And there are also cases that we give it for free. Actually,
Yeah.
we've handled 3 cases for free already.
Okay.
And
very
in the Diocese
Of
of
Caloocan.
Caloocan, it's 100% free.
Yeah, because Bishop Ambo is that has that mindset. No, you know what he said once to a gathering of canon lawyers, because precisely that point came up of we have to cover the costs and said, you know what he said? It's amazing. I said, wow, I like this guy. That was the first time I said to myself, I like this guy. No, because he said, problemahin yun. Dami-dami nyo ng problema. Problema ng obispo yun. No? Basta gawin niyo yung trabaho nyo, yung bahala dyan. Okay yan. So, which is correct. That's the correct attitude. No? By the way, since you're all involved in church things, I've always said, money can never be the problem for doing the work of God. There's money out there and people are willing to help. The only thing is you have to have a good project. You have to do it properly. In my 40 years of priesthood, I have been 50 years in Opus Dei. Never have I been held back by something good I wanted to do for lack of funds. And not because I get it from Opus Dei, no, because I can't get anything from Opus Dei for that matter. All the projects I have done for families, for marriage, is because people give money. But that's it. You have to do it well.
That's correct, Father. Yes, Father. I have here the last question. What do you think how do you think we can improve the pre-Cana in order for the pre-Cana givers or the speakers to detect that these couples are not really meant for each other?
You know, that's very tricky. There's a quick answer, but there's a more truthful answer that you really have to study. You cannot fabricate anything, no? I mean, even as a young professor, I used to teach chemistry. I had always told my students, this business of sharing, I don't believe in it, no, because me, I don't mince words, right? You should have seen that by now. I used to say, not even 100 ignorami or ignoramuses can generate an iota of important truth by sharing things. You learn by getting a professor teaching you what he learned by having a professor himself. So we have to study. So study what marriage is, study what the cases are, study pastoral work, and then that's the first thing, study. And then the second thing is you really have to dedicate time to listening. You have to know the couple. And there is the big problem, because how can you know the couple that much if you're going to see them only one weekend, So the accompaniment for the real pre-K should take longer than just one weekend. It's too short that's why, and here's an important thing that I'm about to say, that marriage is supposed to take place in your own parish, because nowadays people don't even know what their parish is, right? They're so campante about where they are. We're living in a mobile world. You go to mass where it's more comfortable, where it's air conditioned, or where the mall is closest to you afterwards, because you go to mass along the way. No, people should know what their parish is. We have to be parish oriented, because only the parish priest will know his flock. But that's another question. Does the parish priest really know his flock? Well, he should, because otherwise he's not doing his job. So a parish priest might know his flock. So the people who will get married, because they're his parishioners, he knows them. He should know them inside out, and he can advise them properly. Otherwise, then all kinds of, in Spanish we call it le metieron goles, no? They will sink goals in him. Maraming makakalusot, and that's what happens,
Yeah. Thank you very much, Father. I'm supposed to end with that question. However, I cannot deny this person. He's also one of your students or spiritual director daw po kayo. I'd like to call on Lucille Abraham for a brief question. Miss Lucille.
Oh,
Go ahead, Lucille.
Yes,
oh Lucille. First.
Father, this is a question which I would like to ask in behalf of Dr. Paul Santos Estrella. And his question is, hi, Father, I am sure this has been asked before, but I want to hear your reasonable opinion. What will the couple do if differences are irreconcilable? Should they continue to live together? That's the question po of Dr. Paul Santos Estrella po.
Okay. The answer to that is very clear. They committed themselves to make it work. So unless there was something irreconcilable from the very beginning, in which case they shouldn't have gotten married, then they should reconcile. That's what marriage is. Nobody is perfect, and perhaps these are good final words here. Your takeaway from this, no? You and I were all sinners.
Action.
And yet God brought us into existence when we were conceived with a unconditional love. What God has loved into existence, he will not unlove. There's nothing we can do that can change God's love for us. And that's the reason for our hope. That's the reason for our struggle. And by the way, that's also the reason for our sense of responsibility. in the sense that if God loves me that much, kakaya naman if I don't love him back, no? So it's not anymore a question of servile love or servile obedience, but out of loyalty that God deserves it. The same thing happens in marriage. If you really know the person, then you love that person. Love is a free process. You don't love, when they say something, they fell in love. As if, ano yan, nahulog ka sa imburnal. No, 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 no. You love after you have thought and processed that this is the right thing to do, this is the right person to do it with. So therefore, I commit myself for better, for worse, in sickness and health, richer or poorer, till death. Now what happens? If one works at that, then I don't understand this business of irreconcilable differences. Because before something can become irreconcilable, it was a small thing first. We're supposed to work at it and make it reconcile it. If you allow it to fester until it becomes irreconcilable, that's your doing. And nobody should give you the carte blanche to get out of it and perhaps even perpetrate again. No, you're a perp for prolonging that. You see what this is all about? It's all a defense of freedom and human dignity. That since we are free, then that's why we're intelligent first, because freely we can choose. But once we choose, we exhaust. There are some choices that you exhaust the options. And there again, is one of the bane of our civilization, that people don't want to commit themselves. They don't want to commit themselves because they say they will tie their hands and they won't be free anymore. To which one will have to answer, but don't you see that that's the essence of freedom? Freedom is the capacity to determine oneself. Freedom is the capacity to direct oneself in a choice. Not to make a choice is not an act of freedom. Precisely, it's a non-act. Until I commit myself, I haven't exercised my freedom. But once I commit myself, then freely I will stick to it. Nobody can force me otherwise. So I don't believe in irreconcilable differences that developed. I know that there can be irreconcilable differences before, in which case they should not have gotten married because there are those irreconcilable differences. So if they did, it must be because of lack of due discretion. They were not thinking properly, etc., etc. Okay, if you can prove that in court, then declare it invalid. Okay? So irreconcilable differences, they don't arise after. If they arise after, then it should be reconcilable because they're free. Freedom. But if it existed before, then there's no way you can reconcile that because they existed before. No, that's the reason why it's falling apart. Okay?
Thank you,
Yes,
Father.
Father. Yes, thank you, Miss Lucille. I'd like to ask everyone, because I want to give Father a reaction of clap. If you really like what Father Jim said today, talk to you about today, please show it by clapping hand reaction. Hey. Thank you. Thank you so much, Father. At this point, I'd like to call on Dean, Sister Det Abrera, to give us again the summary and the closing remarks before we pray. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Father Jim. It has been a very rich afternoon in terms of learning and discussing. We were given the topic. We were given the discussion by Father Jim on facing the specter of divorce, trusting church wisdom on void marriages, and he explained first that primarily his purpose was in reaching out to SCAD in giving this seminar was to enable us to avoid wasting time and effort. Because for one, for the lawmakers to keep on filing a bill advocating for divorce that even if passed into law by Congress will not stand a challenge eventually before the Supreme Court because it is unconstitutional will be a waste of time. And therefore, it will also be a waste of time for us to spend so much time and effort in fighting a bill that will eventually be ruled as unconstitutional. And we all have to make better use of our time. So there are two basic arguments used by the lawmakers to introduce the divorce bill and also used by its supporters. First would be how to address truly problematic and irreparably broken marriages. And second would be what Father Jim says is the argument of freedom. Telling those who are against divorce, the divorce bill, that we do not have to get a divorce if our marriage is fine, and that the divorce bill therefore will not affect us. So for the first, on the problematic and broken marriages, that was what was developed in this lecture. He argued that in many instances, those problematic marriages reveal themselves to be really defective from the very beginning. And therefore, they are eventually found null. So if found null, then there is no need for divorce. So that was what he developed in the second part of the lecture. For the second argument, on the argument of freedom, he told us really that it affects all marriages, the fine marriages, the struggling marriages, the broken marriages. It affects all marriages because it will change the definition of marriage from indissoluble to dissoluble. Therefore, it weakens the foundation of marriage. Even before entering into marriage, it's already weakened kasi dissoluble na siya. It has been, the meaning has been changed. So the first one that Father Jim made us understand really was the essence of marriage. So from the fundamental characteristics of being a lifetime commitment, total, exclusive, and open to life, he focused on the essence of marriage, which is love. Napakaganda, ano? Conjugal love. That is something that we have to bring out always. Conjugal love. That the fundamental reality of marriage is the spouse's mutual love, their conjugal love, and and that is defined as the mutual self-giving and acceptance of a man and a woman in the totality of their personhood as man and woman, aimed at the perfection of their personhood. So it recalls the beauty of marriage both as a social and a divine institution. So after that, he went now into canon law and showed the juridic structure of marriage, and that there are, he presented the model of canon law in order to assist civil law in simplifying the rationale and the process of declaring marriage nullity. So there are three legs, sabi niya, ano, yung image of a stool with three legs: capacity, consent, and form. So he explained each one: capacity, as there are 12 characteristics that make a person incapable of marriage. The consent is the will to get married. And this is in this part where he says really that the canon law has centuries of experience ahead of civil law, so that in defining the components of genuine consent, in looking at the components of genuine consent, it is canon law that has already articulated into norms those components that can be presented in court. So it makes it juridic. And the foremost ground for nullity is really vitiated or defective consent. And then he also mentions the third will be the form. There are canonical forms of marriage, like the presence of the spouses, the witnesses, the proper place and venue. But of these three legs talaga, the most common cause of juridic marriage nullity will revolve around consent. So, and he says that in the theoretical sense, marriage comes about in the consent of the spouses. And uh, it's a little difficult. That's why we have to lean on canon law, on the experience of the church and its understanding of man and human nature. Consent being the interaction between the intellect and the will of the person. So it's very internal. How can you make it juridic? So we lean on canon law. So the case of nullity can be due to invalid consent. It's the lack of true judgment to get married, a faulty judgment to get married, and canon law is very rich. It can put all its resources behind civil law in order to make that available. So therefore, the last part was a suggestion from him for three things to introduce to the family code in the Philippines, because that's a law, to make the declaration of nullity more agile and accessible. And where the cases of marriage, how do you sift now the cases of marriage where there is really somebody who only wants to renege on his commitment, and so that how will it not pass through because it is wrong for you to renege on a commitment. It is wrong trying to go back on your word, that is wrong. So the state cannot legalize divorce because that is wrong. So first, we have to adopt the provision on the lack of due discretion of judgment based on the invalidity of the marriage consent, very lengthy. Then it would be the adoption of simulation and deceit. And then he also suggests that there should be very clear terminologies to be used, like void and voidable, very confusing. It should be done away with. Just do it. Just say void, and the use of declaration of nullity rather than annulment. So from canon law, we see that it offers a solution that will widen the avenues for addressing problems of marriages that would really be void from the start, meaning no marriage took place, and therefore there is nothing to apply divorce on. So that will not be necessary. And if people just want to renege on their commitments to go back on the promise, then that should not be sanctioned by law, because this is something that's that was very nice. I know when he explained, if you have a right, then there's a responsibility, but you don't. Not it. Those two things are exercised by two different persons or institutions. So you have the right because you have the marriage rights, and therefore who has to enforce that you are afforded that right? It's the state. So the state is responsible in ensuring that the rights of its married citizens are upheld. Therefore, divorce should not be passed. So therefore, we see in the end that canon law provides a model in substance and in process for the declaration of nullity of marriages, and will allow the state to efficiently address truly meritorious cases of really irreparable marriages. So thank you very much, Father Jim.
Oh my God. Thank you very much, Dean Det, Tita Det. Tita Det is the president of Josefa. Thank you so much for that comprehensive summary that you gave about the talk of Father Jim. And before we close, I've actually taken the pictures already. However, the rest does not have, but what's important are the names of those who attended today. Father Jim, we don't know how we could thank you. You see, the SCAD is a struggling coalition, and anybody, but we will see you one of these days, Father Jim, in order to thank you properly. And to all of you, we'd like to extend our gratitude for supporting this super coalition against divorce. This is not only for divorce, it will go on for
Against death.
death. like the SOGI bill, the abortion bill, the same-sex marriage, and everything that is anti-life.
And
So,
anti-family.
and anti-family. So, hang on there, and we're already preparing the documents to be submitted to the Senate. So, thank you for your support, and let's all fight for this cause. We all share this advocacy. Thank you, Father, for giving us this wonderful day, for enlightening us more, because there are so many people also asking for invitation from us. At least it could add up. It was a review of our prejudicial days. So thank you.
And
So
thank you for inviting me.
yeah. Thank you. Kami po ang
It's a
magpapasalamat.
privilege.
It's our pleasure and privilege to be given a talk by you. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to call on Brother Ray to give us the closing prayer.
By the way, thank you very much, Brother Ray, for the use of your Zoom account.
Father, may I ask you to bless us after the prayer, to give us the final blessing, if you don't mind. Okay, Brother Ray.
Yes. Thank you so much, Father. Thank you so much, everybody, for helping to have this. And of course, we need to remember that the one who brought us here together is the one who intended for us to have this group. We have to give praise and thanks to the Lord.
Yes.
So if you can, I would like everybody to sincerely follow our prayer. You may close your eyes and in your hearts truly give thanks to Him who has brought us here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, it is by your will that this happened. Started only with a casual conversation, but it has become a full-scale forum. You have shown us the way. You have told us that your ways are always the best to follow. Allow us, Lord, to see our way forward, to see our directions, to do the things that we must do so that divorce will never happen in the Philippines. We see, O Lord, your vision for our country, that we can be the Catholic country that gives light to the rest of the world, that will show the world that things can be better if only we follow your will. And if each one of us takes on the responsibility to do something about our faith. Allow us, O Lord, to be encouraged, to have this, to have the light of understanding and the guts to follow your will for us. And may we always deepen our understanding of what you want for us. All this we ask in the most powerful name of your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives with you, and the Holy Spirit, God, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
Father Jim, can you please give us your blessing?
Yes, the blessing for the trip. Through the intercession of Holy Mary, may you have a safe trip in this life, in this journey in defense of marriage and the family, and this Christian nation that had been so invested with the sacrifices of centuries of evangelization. May God be on your way, and may his angels accompany you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Father. Thank you, Tita Det. Thank you, everyone. Brother Ray, salamat po. Kuya Wayne, everyone, salamat po ng marami.
Salamat po sa opportunity. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, everyone.